Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Patrick Brenner here, president of the Southwest Public Policy Institute. Thanks for tuning in today for another episode of SPPI-TV. We're on episode 19, Electricity, Past, Present, and Future. And since we're talking about the past a little bit, I want to bring Dowd on because we just got to spend an entire week in San Diego, California, attending a FinTech conference. That was exciting. When are we going to open up our Carlsbad, California
Well, I
office?
have volunteered for that job, Mr. President and
Yes.
founder, and it was the first trip to Southern California for me. I've only been briefly in Northern California many years ago, so that was interesting. But the most fun, of course, was the road trip with the Brenner children, who are three very unique and interesting individuals.
You were a brave man for taking that trip with us. That was awesome. Thank you very much. We got to hit up In-N-Out like 3 or 4
Yeah,
times.
I get there
something
three
like
times,
that.
and El Pollo Locos when the day I had by myself. So it was a big trip for Dowd Muska, definitely.
What an experience. And we learned a lot too. I mean, some of those breakout sessions were fantastic. Gave us some additional insight into some of the more intricate issues that we're working on here at SPPI.
Yeah, there's I got the sort of bug was put in my ear on a lawsuit that's been filed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but they're filing it. They filed it down in Texas regarding banking regulation, and because Texas is in the American Southwest, we're going to be on that story, that issue a lot moving forward. We'll probably have some future episodes of the television show on it.
Super. Awesome. Can't wait to engage on that. The United States Chamber of Commerce. Well, speaking of lawsuits, we can talk about some of our litigation really quick. The Southwest Public Policy Institute is preparing to litigate against a local New Mexico municipality. We're really excited about that. They've been delaying access to certain public records for over 9 months, and we'll be announcing that lawsuit coming in the next couple weeks. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And enough about that. Let's bring on our very special guest, Kenny Stein, Vice President for Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. Energy is a pillar of our work here at the Southwest Public Policy Institute. We keep coming back to it, keep plugging the nuclear space, keep unplugging the solar and wind problem. But Dowd and Kenny, I'll hand it off to you guys. Take it away. Have fun.
Great, we will, Patrick. And this is, issue very near and dear to my heart with an employee of an organization that's very near and dear to my heart, the Institute for Energy Research. Folks, you can't do better in the policy realm than the work these fine people are doing. Kenny, thank you so much for joining us on this hot August day, and I thought we were going to do electricity because it's never more timely than in August, and particularly a rather hot year for a big part of the country, although some parts of the country are actually a little cooler than normal. But we relish our air conditioning, and I think air conditioning runs off electricity. I'm going to start, as we always do with SPPI-TV, with the background, with history. Patrick and I are, of course, our history buffs. According to the National Academy of Sciences, affordable and reliable electricity is a cornerstone of modern industrialized societies. Electricity provides lighting and cooling, powers our digital world, and supports essential services like drinking water and wastewater treatment, public safety, food supply, communications, financial services, and healthcare. So minor needs like that. When power goes out, even briefly, our daily lives and economy are severely disrupted. The National Academy of Engineering, not the National Academy of Sciences, called our grid, the U.S. electric grid, quote, the supreme engineering achievement of back to the Pearl Street station, our brilliant Mr. Edison putting that in place in New York City in 1882. It's been with us a long time. And another study from the National Academy of Sciences calls our electrical grid just this description. In the grid, in its actual operation, is an overwhelmingly complex system with millions of individual components and interactions across time dominions that span milliseconds to decades, and spatial dominions from individual customers to synchronization across millions of square miles. That's what we're talking about today, folks. A massive system that we would not have the luxuries and amenities that we enjoy every day without it. So, Kenny, thanks for joining us to talk about electricity today.
Sure, happy to be here.
Great. We're going to start, as I just sort of set that in the background, I think most of us are thinking about air conditioning right now in the hot zones of the United States, but only 39% of our electricity consumption in America is in the residential space. 35% of it is in the commercial space in terms of consumption. 26% is in the industrial space. Electricity is a lot more than just when we flick a light switch on, isn't it?
Right. I mean, it's the backbone of modern society. Like pretty much everything that we take for granted in the modern day is goes back to electricity. It's either made with electricity. Sometimes it's transported with electricity, and certainly it powers our homes, not just air conditioning, but lights when you turn it on, any appliances you have. Some people's stoves are powered with natural gas, but a lot of people's stoves are electric. The offices you go to, so it's again, I'll repeat it, but it's the foundation of modern society.
Absolutely. How do we get our electricity? We're gonna get into the whole issue of electric choice down the road, but people, all too often, people don't think enough about their sort of day-to-day lives and how government and markets affect them. But most of us continue to get our electricity from one of those traditional investor-owned utilities, although some of us get our electricity from sort of government-owned enterprises or cooperatives. Just briefly, who are the providers of our electricity?
Well, so actually, in the last 20 years or so, it's actually gotten a lot more fragmented. If you go back several decades, pretty much everybody got their electricity from whoever had the monopoly over their area of the country or their city, their state, what have you. Every state's a little bit different with how they operate these things. But with some of the market liberalizations that have been attempted in the last several decades, there's a lot more different providers now. And in some states, you actually can choose different retail providers. In other states, like where I am in Virginia, we do not have a choice of our retail provider. We're stuck with either Dominion or one of the smaller regional co-ops. But ultimately, even the way the markets have been adjusted in different parts of the country, it's different, but a lot of places the generation itself is actually produced by a different company than necessarily the retail provider that you're connecting to. Often the wires in between the power plants and the wire that goes to your house are owned by a different company or operated by a different company. So again, depending on the state, there's a lot of different ways that it's provided to you, but ultimately, the baseline is it is generated somewhere. It's transported over wires, sometimes over very long distances, and then it plugs into your house with the wire that's either under the ground or through the air into your house. And again, there's several different. In some states that's all one company. It's all the same. From end to end, it's all owned by the same monopoly utility. In other states, there can be 2, 3, lots of intermediaries in between you and the electricity that's actually created.
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned the choice, and we can maybe get into that a little early. I was working in Nevada about 20 years ago when the California deregulation went through, and Nevada actually had a pretty good deregulation plan in place, and that whole got swept away when the whole California debacle happened. And we could easily do an hour on that one, folks. But last night I was sort of clicking around, putting my notes together for the show today, and talking about choice, and that does still sound foreign to a lot of folks. I just picked 10 communities at random. I was just picking out zip codes in our 8-state region: Tucson, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, Nevada, Colorado Springs, Carlsbad, California, where Patrick and I were last week, Norman, Oklahoma, and a couple spots in Utah. So out of those 10 that I looked at, only Houston allowed for electric choice. It was interesting. For residential customers in Houston, they had 27 different options. Pretty interesting for folks, at least in Houston, if not every part of Texas. So choice is a thing in some states, but I would argue that we need to dramatically expand those options. California's bungling of it 20 years ago, I think, hurt the cause a lot. Kenny, can you talk a little bit about what's, I think, improperly called public power? I would call it government power. There really are a lot of folks on the left, and of course people in that industry themselves, whether it's sort of your local city owning a utility, or whether it's one of those monster federal, the Bonneville Power Administration or the Tennessee Valley Authority. How does so-called public power differ from the more traditional that most of investor-owned utilities or state-regulated utilities that we get our juice from? And do you find the argument that we need more public power convincing?
So yeah, just at the outset, there's really three main types of utilities in the United States. You mentioned investor-owned utilities, which are private companies. There's rural co-ops, which are co-ops that are the member. That's where I live. I'm a member of the co-op, and I get to vote on the decisions of the utility. And then you also have public power, which is what you're bringing up here. And public power is it is owned by a government entity of some sort. As you said, there's several federal government entities, mainly going back to they date back to the New Deal when a lot of big dams were built. But there are municipalities that have their own power generation that basically the idea behind it is that electricity, as we said at the start, it is foundational to modern life. And there's, I guess, philosophy that it's too important to be left to the private markets, to private actors, and that it needs to be, in order to provide the most reliability and the least cost, what have you, it can be done through a public power provision. Now, there's arguments back and forth. If you have benevolent bureaucrats in charge of a public power system, it can work pretty well. If they're working to provide the cheapest electricity to their population, it can work. The problem is that because it's owned by a public entity, you have politics that can tend to infect decision makings within the utility, and most recently that has tended to be forcing more wind and solar to be used by a public utility than would make sense if you were pursuing truly the lowest prices for your customers. So that's really public power isn't inherently bad, but it allows politics to very quickly infect the decision-making process, and that ultimately can hurt the ratepayers themselves, who, again, in a public power situation, they have no control. They can try and vote their mayor out if they want, but local elections tend to not be about electricity policy necessarily. So a lot of these things, there's not really any accountability per se.
Yeah, and I also think there's a big issue with so-called public power, as I've looked at it over the years, in terms of getting a full cost accounting of that.
Yes.
The cost that they report when they're peddling this notion that, we're so much cheaper, we don't have to make a profit. People who really pick that apart more seriously have found some major flaws.
Well, just because municipalities can get loans much cheaper than a private company, and who pays for those loans? The costs of that can be spread around and hidden a bit. So yes, that's why I say it's arguable how much cheaper it really might be. But again, it's not inherently bad, but there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of costs that can get hidden. And ultimately you don't know, because again, this is the problem with government bureaucracies, is getting answers from them is often very difficult.
That's why our organization files a lot of lawsuits, but that's a topic for another day. We get our juice. It's interesting when the concept of dependency, or dependent on foreign oil, or depending on this mineral or that mineral. But right now, in terms of the breakdown, and these are from federal data, 38% of all of our energy consumed in the United States is used to create the electricity that powers us. And that is a huge, it wasn't even that long ago when that percentage was down to like 15-20%, while most of our power, most of our energy was used to heat our homes and that sort of thing. We're producing over a third of our total energy consumption now is to produce electricity, because it impacts so many parts of our lives. But our generation by source is really interesting. And Kenny, I'd like to kind of walk you through each and every one of these in order of how much they contribute to our juice. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 categories, and there's a couple of super minor things we don't have to get into. But starting off with natural gas, I hate to break it to our friends on the environmental left, but in 2022, according to the federal government, Energy Information Administration, natural gas produced the plurality of our electricity at 40%. Kenny, your thoughts on the role of natural gas? Obviously, huge player in electricity generation.
Yeah, it's been, and that is a big change from even just 15 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. Natural gas in some areas of the country, like for instance, I'm from Texas. In Texas, there's always been abundant natural gas because it comes up with the oil. So there's been electricity generation from natural gas in Texas for a while. But in a lot of parts of the country, natural gas was relatively expensive. And so it didn't make sense to use for power generation. So the fact that natural gas is the largest producer of electricity, that's really something that's only happened in the last few years. And it's interesting that I'm sure you'll get into it as the next one, but that most of what has happened is natural gas has displaced coal. That's it's almost one for one. Where, and we talk about you mentioned some of the environmental concerns. Ultimately the conventional fuels, some people will call them fossil fuels. Their total percentage has not fallen very much. It's just that coal generation has been swapped for natural gas generation.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note that when people in the coal industry, I am completely agnostic about all energy sources. I want and doesn't pollute the air with real pollution, which I don't think carbon dioxide is real pollution. But anyway, it's natural gas, because of the fracking revolution, has stolen a lot of market share from coal. Now, obviously, people in Washington, the environmentalists, want to destroy the coal industry, but I think we don't talk enough about the role that cheaper natural gas has played in hurting coal, which is more of a market-oriented adjustment as well. And can you talk, I mean, neither one of us is an engineer, but can you talk about the combined cycle natural gas plant? I mean, these little devices have popped up in recent decades all over the country that are creating so much of our juice, and they're just super efficient ways to create electricity.
Right. Well, yeah, and I am not an engineer, so if I garble some of the explanation, I apologize for the experts listening. But the idea behind combined cycle is that you're generating electricity in two ways. You've got the primary, when you're actually burning the natural gas, that heat can drive a generator. But then the heat from that burning can then be captured and used to heat water, to drive a steam turbine, or to like that sort of thing. So that's the idea, is that it's a much more efficient way of using the natural gas, because you capture is basically you're generating power from the heat you're getting from burning the natural gas. And in a combined cycle system, you capture more of that heat energy and can channel it into electricity production. Whereas, and this is the growth of combined cycle has been relatively recent as well. If you go back quite a few decades, when natural gas was first starting to be used, and even nowadays, there's still plants that only use the primary natural gas combustion. Those are typically our peaker plants. But the idea behind those is that they can be turned off, on and off much quicker, but they're much less efficient in their use of natural gas, and therefore they tend to be more expensive. They're not ideal for electricity generation, except as sort of emergency backup.
Yeah, and I'm glad you talked about peaking, particularly given our summer. And we're going to get into the issue of dispatchable versus non-dispatchable, which is so important. And if you ask 100 people on the street, 99 of them are not going to know anything about that. They're just going to say, why isn't everything run by solar and wind? Okay, coal. According to the feds, coal in 2022 produced 20% of our juice, net utility scale generation. Talk a little bit about that shift, Kenny, because as you said, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, the coal was still producing more than half. And I remember writing a column a number of years ago that Edison's first central power plant in 1882 was a coal-powered plant. And at the year I was writing that op-ed, coal was still 51%. It was 120, 130 years later, and coal was still more than half of the fuel source for our electricity. I hate to break it to our friends on the left, but energy transitions take time, long decades, if not centuries. You can't just snap your fingers. But coal, it's number 2, Kenny. It's far from dead in America. It still makes a pretty important contribution.
Right. Yeah, I believe coal generation for electricity peaked in around 2005 or so, the mid 2000s, and it's been on a long, slow decline ever since. But as you mentioned, coal has actually gotten hit from both directions. There's one is cheap natural gas, and that has hit coal really hard, especially because a lot of coal plants tended to be older. They'd been around 50s, 60s, sometimes even older than that. And so those older plants were relatively less efficient. And once you had cheap natural gas available, building a new, very efficient natural gas plant made more sense to replace your old coal plant than, say, building a new, because you needed to build a new plant anyway. So the cheaper availability of natural gas made people more likely to build a natural gas plant to replace those old coal plants. So that's kind of what's happened over the last, we're getting close to 20 years now of that decline. But coal still provides an important, we can talk about dispatchable versus not dispatchable, but it still provides that important baseline of generation. And it's partly because we have plenty of coal here in the United States. It's very available. It's still quite cheap. And it's reliable. It's the type of thing that, even natural gas, we saw this in Texas during the winter storm Uri. Natural gas comes through pipelines. And so it's just in time delivery. Whereas coal, you can build up a coal pile at the power plant. You can actually, it's easier to store than natural gas. So there is definitely a value to having coal in the mix still. And again, as prices fluctuate, natural gas for a long time was really cheap, but then in the pandemic era, and now with the rise in LNG exports, suddenly coal is much more cost competitive than it had been even 5 years ago or so. So it's certainly still an important element of our electricity generation. Now, no one in the United States no utility is building new coal plants right now, and that becomes from the other side of where coal is getting hit is from regulation. So you've got the cost side that's really hammered coal, but at the same time you've had the federal government and plenty of states working really hard to try and eliminate coal for electricity generation entirely. And so that has been, places like California have tried to mandate zero emissions. Up at the federal level, they don't have the power to truly mandate zero emissions, but they keep coming out with new rules. Obama had the Clean Power Plan. The Biden administration is working on finalizing their new version of the Clean Power Plan, which basically they set emissions requirements mainly for greenhouse gases at such a low level that it's virtually impossible for a coal plant to comply. Even if they do carbon capture, it would be, which as a cost matter has not been proven to actually work. Sure. But it would be so cost prohibitive to install carbon capture on an existing coal plant that the rulemaking that the Biden administration is trying to push through is effectively a requirement to close down the last remaining coal plants.
Well, and it's so frustrating for anyone who's looking at the international situation, Kenny, because boy, our large economies abroad, developing nations, not committing to either eliminate their existing coal plants or not build any more. The numbers out of China are insane. India is still a huge consumer of coal. And, when I look at our Four Corners region, sort of the heart of our American Southwest, the four states coming together, what's been done there with the coal mines and with the coal plants being shut down with the enthusiastic support of elected officials in Arizona, New Mexico. It's just mystifying. The Associated Press did a story, it might have been earlier this year, and there was a local person up in the Four Corners area wondering, I don't know who to blame for this. Our community is being devastated. Well, lady, all the people you've been voting for decades are the people who put this into place or were major contributors to this. Talk about coal on the international scene. We may be doing our damnedest to destroy it here, Kenny, but that's certainly not the case abroad.
Yeah, that's very true. And look, the only reason that anybody in the United States can talk seriously about eliminating coal for electricity generation is because we have a surfeit of natural gas. That's the only reason anybody is even considering this, because this is what's happened in Europe is with the war in Ukraine and suddenly the disruption of Russian natural gas supplies. Countries like Germany are going back to coal generation for electricity because ultimately in a democracy, people want to be able to flip the light switch and the lights to go on. And so they're not going to give that up in exchange, because environmentalists have captured the political class. So ultimately, the United States, we are uniquely lucky that we actually probably could eliminate coal for electricity generation because we have so much natural gas domestically. It actually might even be feasible, but in the rest of the world, they do not have the type of natural gas reserves that we have, except outside of a few countries in the Middle East and North Africa maybe. But as you said, countries like China and India, they've got some natural gas reserves, but it's fairly small. But both these countries and most countries around the world, most larger countries have significant coal deposits somewhere in their country. That's one of the things about coal is that it is distributed widely across the United States in concentrated, or not the United States, around the world, in concentrated qualities. And again, as we said, it's easy to transport. It's easy to dig up. It keeps. Storage of it is not really a big deal. So it's actually an ideal electricity generation for when you're first starting to electrify areas. And that's why it became so dominant in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, is because when you have a weak electrical grid, which is what you have outside, the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, and a few other Asian countries, they have very weak electrical infrastructure. So being able to build a coal power plant, being able to easily transport your fuel for those power plants just makes sense for all these countries as a purely practical matter. Now, in the United States, environmentalists are talking about, people need to use less electricity. In a country like India, the population will not accept that, and the government doesn't believe that. The government wants their population to be able to use more electricity because, as we said, it's the foundation of modern life. An abundance of cheap electricity is what makes our modern comforts what they are. So all these countries around the world, with only a couple exceptions, even authoritarian governments, certainly democratic governments, they want more power. They want more electricity for their populations, and they want it at the least cost. So that means coal. In most countries around the world, that means coal. So they're doing what's best for their populations, and honestly, they don't have much interest in hearing from people in the United States and Europe that tell them, oh, well, you shouldn't use that. Because the alternative for these countries to coal is not wind and solar. It's no electricity.
Right. And to me, it's the height of arrogance and elitism of wealthy people in the Western world to tell developing countries that, well, you have all this poverty and infant mortality, but you really need to be worried about your carbon dioxide output. I mean,
green imperialism.
Yeah, these people have they have day-to-day challenges and crises that those of us in the modern world at any income level just can't even imagine. Folks, we are delighted to be talking to Kenny Stein of the Institute for Energy Research. Great group. There's so much bad information out there about energy. I would go to probably the IER before I would go to any other source. Dynamite stuff. Their interpretation and their analysis. We're focusing today's show mostly on electricity. I'm going to really try to get the time to talk to Kenny about a great study that his organization did just a couple months ago. I wrote my weekly column about it regarding shutting down oil and gas development in the United States and then pushing that abroad where environmental standards are not as robust as they are in the United States and in the developed world. So when you're trying to destroy that industry here, you're actually, de facto, you're arguing for more environmental pollution, which I'd really love to get the time on that. But we have so many electricity issues. Shoot us a question, shoot us a comment. We'd love to get your feedback on, whatever platform you are watching right now. And if you're watching the rerun, don't, because we're live right now and you're not. Kenny Stein is our guest. We talked about the 40% of our electricity that's generated via natural gas and the 20% generated by coal. That is the utility scale electricity. And these are the federal government's numbers, folks, not the Southwest Public Policy Institute's. Coming in at number 3. Sorry, Eco Left. It's not solar and it's not wind. It's nuclear. 18% of the power of the utility scale juice produced in our country in 2022 was generated by nuclear plants, an industry certainly a lot of folks on the environmental left would like to see destroyed. But Kenny, the nuclear industry, it has this stubborn ability to just hang on to get license renewals for its existing plants, to uprate its plants and even produce more power, to run its plants at 95% of their capacity factor, something that was just the industry didn't even come close to achieving 95% capacity factor decades ago. Now it's sort of a regular thing. Your thoughts about the state of the nuclear industry in the United States? Still a big player, baseload power, if you're an environmental leftist, carbon-free electricity generation. Your thoughts on atomic plants?
Sure. And there's a reason why nuclear continues to stick around is because it is so valuable. And the key with nuclear is, you sort of mentioned it, but once a nuclear plant is built, it can run for a long time, and it's really cheap to run. It's among the cheapest sources of electricity once built. The knock on nuclear, of course, is the initial cost to build a power plant. And unfortunately, I would argue a lot of it is through regulation, but also, also our litigious culture and safetyism. There's a lot of reasons that nuclear is very expensive to build now. We're finally just in the last week or two now, we're finally getting the first nuclear plant to come, first new nuclear plant to come online in many decades. Has finally just come online, but most of our nuclear plants date back to the 70s or early 80s. And back then there was a big move that, because everyone recognized the value of nuclear, that it's the footprint of nuclear is extremely small. Nuclear power plants are not huge. They can be built close to population centers, and so the generation doesn't have to travel very far. You don't need a lot of transmission. You need very little fuel. The uranium fuel gets an enormous amount of energy from a very small package. So your mining footprint for uranium is relatively small. And as you said, the capacity factor is fantastic. It can run near full tilt. The only downside to nuclear, besides, as you said, the startup costs, which, you know, who's at fault for that is an open question. But the other problem is that nuclear is not flexible. And, you know, before everyone became obsessed with intermittent renewables, with wind and solar, that didn't matter. Nuclear was actually perfect for providing your base load, your all-day energy that you needed all times of the day or night. But then when you start introducing wind and solar, that actually adds value to flexibility, which that has really harmed nuclear as we were talking about some of the market mechanisms that have been introduced in the last few years. There's a lot of flexibility is prized. And so that makes the life for nuclear a lot harder, because nuclear reactors cannot be, you know, turned off and on with the flick of a switch. You know, that's what we talked about. Some natural gas plants are designed to operate like that. Nuclear is not. So that has the introduction of intermittent generation sources has really destabilized the nuclear industry, and that's really why a lot of nuclear power plants have closed in the United States in the last 2 decades. It's not because they aren't efficient or they don't provide cheap electricity. It's that they can't operate in this sudden up and down price market. And here's another contrast with the rest of the world. The rest of the world, particularly China, but also several European countries, there's a lot of places in the world that are re-recognizing the value of nuclear and are starting to build nuclear plants, because, again, it is extremely cheap once up and running. It can run forever. The nuclear waste issue is not really an issue. That was something that was created out of whole cloth by the Green Movement. Mm-hmm. It's one of their founding myths, is that nuclear waste is somehow dangerous. And here we are 50 years later, and a lot of people still believe that. So, you know, nuclear, unfortunately, for whatever reason, I know why. It's because of the green capture, environmentalist capture of the media. Nuclear gets a bad rap, even though it is a fantastic energy source. And frankly, if the United States has continued on the path we started in the 1970s of building out nuclear plants to provide all our electricity generation, we wouldn't, this whole argument about greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector wouldn't even be an argument, because we'd have nuclear power providing the vast majority of our electricity. I mean, that's the situation in France right now, is that they have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions. If you care about that stuff, France has the lowest greenhouse gas emissions by electricity in Europe. Well, maybe some of the Scandinavian countries, but one of the lowest, let's put it that way. And it's because of nuclear. It's not because of wind and solar.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned France, because I think last time I checked, it was something like 75%. I mean, just a massive, strong majority of their electricity produced by nuclear. You're not going to find a more big government, pro-progressive place than France, and they're in love with nuclear. And I think that the line back when they started going nuclear decades ago was, France has no oil, France has no gas, France has no choice. And so that was their philosophy behind going nuclear. And I think they've lived they can rightfully gloat about it. And the other thing that you mentioned, Kenny, was interesting about nuclear plants is the sort of Helen Caldicott professional alarmist anti-nuclear kooks. The notion that these plants are old. One of their favorite talking points is that, you know, these plants are so old, and then you're renewing their licenses for another 20 or 40 years. I watched a debate a couple of years ago where there was a nuclear engineer versus a real, you know, kooky environmentalist, and he said, you know, the line that this accusation that our plants are old is really interesting, because we have a constant maintenance and sort of renewal project at every plant. If you go drive by a nuclear plant, that's not everything inside that plant has been replaced over the years. It's not what was there in 1967. We replace all the electronics, we replace all the pumps and the piping and the valves. I mean, those things are constantly being replaced. So the idea that these are old clunkers just waiting to, you know, blow up and do a Chernobyl, there's a reason why they keep not doing that because
Right.
maintenance is very important in that industry, and they know that things can go wrong. Another aspect that people don't know is how prevalent people who've worked in the nuclear navy end up going into the nuclear power industry. I mean, really serious people who were in nuclear powered ships and boats, I guess boats in terms of underwater, the submarines, people where, some of these 21-year-old kids are sleeping inches away from a nuclear reactor that's propelling their ship and providing electricity for the submarine, I should say, the boat. And it's an interesting career track for people who come out of the nuclear navy and then take their professionalism and their seriousness and go on into commercial nuclear power. That's just my own take on that. I think it's pretty impressive, those folks. All right, now number 4. Again, we'll recap if you're joining us late. 40% of our electricity produced via natural gas in 2022, 20% coal, 18% what we just discussed, nuclear, 10%, barely out of single digits for wind. A lot of people think maybe they're driving around and they see these wind turbines. They think that that's an enormous amount of our juice comes from wind. Kenny, even with all of the mandates, with all of the subsidies, decades worth of that now, wind is still at only 10%.
Right. Well, and it's part of the issue is that each individual wind turbine that you see is not producing that much electricity. Unlike a power plant, when you see a power plant, that's probably powering the nearest medium-sized city. Like there's a lot of power coming out of that individual facility. Whereas wind is because it's much more distributed, you need hundreds or thousands of wind turbines to provide even just that 10% of general electricity generation. And the other problem with wind is that we've mentioned it a couple times, is that it's intermittent. So, you have to overbuild wind in order to get a larger percentage of your state's electricity generation from wind. You have to build 2 and 3 times the number of wind turbines because they don't run all the time. So unlike a nuclear plant, say, you can build a nuclear plant, how much electricity it can generate, and you can plan for that. With a wind turbine, it can be up and down. You never know exactly how much it's going to be. So you have to build redundancy. You need to build one wind turbine in 4 corners of your state in order to maybe get enough electricity to provide for the value of 1 wind turbine. So again, you see a lot of wind turbines around. There's a lot of money that's being spent to subsidize them, but when it actually comes down to electricity that's generated and also used, it's not a huge percentage. And I say used because sometimes when the wind's blowing and there's a ton of electricity being generated, you have to curtail that
Right.
electricity because it's not needed when the wind's blowing. Like if the wind's blowing in the middle of the night, there's not many people up using their electricity in the middle of the night. So again, there's a lot of hype around wind, but it is even now, it is still a very limited part of our electricity generation. And again, 10% of electricity generation is a minority of the total power used in the economy as a whole. So it's got great PR, but it's a pretty small percentage of what drives our economy.
Yeah, and the other there's 7 other things to talk about wind, but the windiest part of the United States, when you're not talking about offshore, because we're not, other than Southern California, our region of the country doesn't have much of a coast, that it's the central part of the, from the Dakotas down to the Texas Panhandle, the windiest part of the country, just a little to the east and a little to the west of that section. And that is the most unpopulated part of the country if you look at the demographic, population concentration map. So you have to build transmission lines to get that wind power to the population centers. And that's also a problem in some of the solar areas as well. We never really talk about that. But at IER, Kenny, I know you wouldn't venture a specific estimate, but wind at 10% of our electricity contribution, were it not for state and federal mandates that politically correct electricity be generated, were it not for decades of subsidization, I mean, would wind even be 1% of our generation?
Most of the country, I seriously doubt it. And this is in contrast to solar. Solar does have utility in especially in the Southwest. Like there are parts of this country where solar actually actually does make sense and contributes to the grid. But the problem with wind is that because of its intermittency, it would not be used for electricity generation in the absence of subsidies. Now say we have some magic breakthroughs in battery storage of electricity. All right, then in such an event, maybe you could make a case for wind, because then you'd be able to store it. But that such a breakthrough still has not happened. So I think you can attribute the vast majority of wind. Again, now there's some place like Hawaii might still be doing wind generation because they don't have coal and they don't have natural gas. They have no alternatives. Right. So some places like that, and maybe in North Dakota might still have some wind just because it's so windy. But it would I would venture that it maybe 1%, maybe it would not be near 10%, just because it as a practical matter, it's very expensive, and it's again, as you said, it's not near population centers, and people don't want wind turbines near their houses in the first place. New York City's not letting people build wind turbines down the length of Manhattan or in Central Park. There's a lot of downsides to wind, and if they can force it to be built, if they can subsidize it to be built on someone's ranch or ruining their view. I'm from Texas, and I've driven through the Panhandle, and the industrialization of the landscape is horrific out there, honestly. Yeah. But of course, it's the little people living in rural areas that have to deal with that, so that people in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio can feel pat themselves on the back about having green electricity.
Sure. And you're so right about the where wind does impact population centers, particularly more affluent centers. There was, I think, somewhere near Cape Cod, it might have been Falmouth years ago, where the flicker when the sun was low in the winter months, where the flicker from the shadow of the blade spinning people were saying they were getting headaches and they were having seizures, and it's so much more complicated. It's very easy sitting at the Sierra Club headquarters to wave your hand and say we're going to remake industrial society, but when the rubber meets the road, sometimes it's not quite so simple. 40% natural gas, 20% coal, and a partridge in a pear tree, 18% nuclear, only 10% last year, folks. Wind, 1 in 10, even with all that government support. All right, our fifth category. Now, I imagine a lot of you might be tempted to say, well, after wind comes solar, of course. No, au contraire. Traditional old sort of FDR 1920s, 1930s, hydroelectric coming in at 6%. My favorite hydroelectric facility, of course, in the United States, Elephant Butte Dam down in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, where they let you walk across the dam on January 1st every year. I've only done it once. I'd like to do it a couple more times. Everybody brings their dogs out and everybody walks across the dam. Beautiful old, there's Art Deco kind of stylings there, fascinating place. But people tend to think of things like Grand Coulee Dam and Hoover Dam, the really big boys. Hydro, Kenny, more than solar. Hydro at 6%, still hanging on, even though I think most of our so-called environmental friends would like to blow up every dam.
Well, there's certainly a lot of dams that they want to blow up. I think for most, the crazy fringe folks probably want to destroy every dam in America. But to be fair to environmentalists, most of them aren't calling to tear down the existing dams, except maybe in Washington State. There's some of that. But however, they absolutely are adamantly opposed to building any new dams, even though they claim they care about greenhouse gas emissions, and hydropower does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. They are adamantly opposed to building any new dams anywhere. So yes, it's an important electricity source, because again, it's dispatchable, it's storable. Like you can build up water in the dam over time and release it later. So it's actually very important for the flexibility of the electricity grid, for that providing a baseload power generation. But it's people don't want to build it anymore because it's expensive in environmental permits and processes. It's also limited by geography. Like if you don't have the steep valleys or sort of mountains around you, you can't really build an effective power plant. Damming up the creek, outside of Houston, you'll back up some water, but it's not going to generate that much power when you run it through a turbine. So it's very much limited by geography, but it's a great energy source if you've got the geography for it. This is why when for people who people like to talk about. There's a professor in California who likes to talk about wind, water, solar, and how every country in the world could be 100% renewables with wind, water, solar. Well, the only countries that get anywhere close to that 100% are countries like, say, in Scandinavia, where they have a huge amount of hydro, and then they've got nuclear. So that's how you get to zero greenhouse gas emissions, is hydro and nuclear. And of course, those are two things that the environmentalists don't want to let anybody build.
Yeah, it's always heads I win, tails you lose with those folks. Don't get me started. Our viewer John is weighing in on solar. He wants us to get into solar, and that's actually where we're headed, because at 3% utility scale generation last year, solar contributed a mere 3% to our electric usage. And Kenny, we did a study. We're a brand new organization, but our first study we released late last year was the vast unimpressiveness of solar in the American Southwest, our 8 states of the American Southwest. Utility scale solar in California is doing fairly well, I guess, grading on a curve, but in our other 7 states, really doing quite abysmal. Kenny, from the Institute for Energy Research, sunshine's free. It's delivered by the good Lord or mother sun, depending on your paganistic or religious view. The sun shines, it's free, it just lands on those solar panels. Why don't we get all of our electricity from solar?
Right. Well, solar, like wind, solar has the problem of intermittency. Obviously, you only get solar when the sun's actually up during the day. Now, the one thing, this is why when we were talking about wind, I said that solar does have some utility, particularly in certain parts of the United States, because at the low percentages that we're talking about 3%, in the single digit percentages, solar generation can actually help meet your peak demand in the middle of the afternoon when everybody's running their air conditioning on a 110 degree day. So that's when solar is producing the most electricity. So it can actually help ease the strain, that peak load. It can help meet peak load. The problem is that once you start getting more of that on the grid, you have a problem, because instead of your peak generation need coming in the afternoon, you can get to where your peak is actually coming after the sun goes down. And that's in the utility space that people talk about that as the duck curve. That's the situation California has now, where during the day they have so much solar generation that their electricity demand is, depending on the day, depending on how much people are using, that sort of thing, they can get down pretty close to zero demand, zero need for electricity from anything other than solar. The problem is that as soon as the sun goes down, every power plant in the state has to be switched on and ramped up extremely quickly to meet the demand for people getting home from work and turning on a TV or wanting to cook food. So when you start getting up to really high penetrations of solar, it just destabilizes everything. It gets expensive, because you're having to maintain all that backup capacity, which is mostly natural gas, but some other things. That plant has to sit idle during the day, or mostly idle during the day, but you're still paying workers, you're still paying maintenance, and you have to be ready to ramp up really quickly when the sun goes down. And that's an inefficient way to use natural gas, especially. And we talked about the 2 different types of generation plants. A cogeneration plant, which is the most efficient way to make electricity with natural gas, can't just flick on and off like that. It needs ramp up time. That's why you end up using a peaker plant for that quick ramp. The problem is peaker plants are much less efficient and therefore
more
much more
expensive.
expensive. Yeah. So the problem with solar is that, again, in small penetrations, especially in sunny areas, in Florida, in Arizona, in Southern California, that it can be useful to help you meet peak load, maybe 3 to 5% or so. We did a study a few years ago that I think the value to the grid phases out around 5% or so when it starts to harm the stability of the grid and the value, your value proposition. But the thing is that solar isn't just being built or subsidized in sunny places. You have states like Massachusetts that massively subsidize solar panels, and they're covered in snow all winter. Yep. And it's these northern latitudes where they don't get very good solar radiation, and yet everyone's got solar panels on their roof. That's not providing any value to the grid, frankly.
Yeah, absolute madness. I was home a month and a half ago in Connecticut, and Connecticut River Valley. My family has an orchard there, and it's a very cigar tobacco is grown in the Connecticut River Valley, world famous cigar tobacco. People in our town are up in arms. There's industrial scale solar being built, and prime farmland is being chewed up for solar panels. And you're right about the snow. There was recently, I believe it was in Nebraska, there was a hailstorm that severely, just wiped out a utility scale solar facility. These are not robust facilities the way a hardened coal plant or nuclear plant. The weather can you're relying on the weather to get your fuel, but the weather can also hurt your facility in all sorts of ways. We're talking to Kenny Stein, folks. I can't believe we were 51 minutes into this, because we have my notes. I barely even touched my notes so far. But this is good stuff. Really, really good stuff. We promised Kenny we'll get them out at the hour. We're gonna wrap up with 1%. 1% of our electricity. We're going to wrap up our discussion of what contributes to our electricity, what generates our electricity, with biomass. It's around 1%. Landfill gas, wood and wood refuse, recycled wood, bioenergy. Kenny, boy, a lot of hype behind that, but again, in the case of the rubber meeting the road, even with all those subsidies and all that good press, biomass is not really a player in producing our electricity.
Yeah. It's a perfectly good energy source, and it's good to use waste gas, like from landfills or from incinerators, or it's good to use it, but it's inherently limited. It's great to have, but it's not going to power the entire economy.
Yeah. And the final was less than 1% with geothermal, which we're going to have Kenny on a separate show to talk about geothermal. We are running desperately low on time. Our electricity future, Mr. Stein, a lot of us, without trying to paint a ridiculous Charlton Heston, dystopian future, but a lot of us, I think, are legitimately concerned as we talk today about relying so much on non-dispatchable, intermittent, inefficient, frequently unreliable sources like solar and wind. In the IER's view, in order to preserve the two things that people really, at the end of the day, the two things that people care the most about, and we've done survey research on this, affordable and reliable electricity is what people want. Environmental concerns are down the road. Those are the big two. When your organization engages on this in terms of the policies, not dictating outcomes, but in terms of the policies, state governments and the federal government, how should legislators and regulators be looking at the best ways to keep our electricity, which we have had for over 100 years in this country, reliable and affordable?
Well, so this is the key. The reason that wind and solar have gotten to the point that they are is it's subsidization, but it's also they've had a free ride. There is the existing generation capacity from coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro has been able to be flexible enough to account for their intermittency. Now, that's been done at great cost. It has not been cheap, and it has driven a number of, especially coal plants, but it's driven nuclear plants out of business too. So it has not been cheap to accommodate wind and solar, but we've been able to do it while still maintaining, for the most part, except for California and Texas, maintaining reliability. The problem is that the more, especially wind, but also solar, the more renewables that are forced onto the grid, the less reliable things become, and the more expensive things become. Now, with unlimited money, rates, sky high rates, massive federal subsidies, maybe you could pretend that you're running on 100% renewables. Like if you build out enough wind and solar to generate electricity, and then you have to build out enough battery capacity to back it up, and then you also have to pay for a few natural gas plants to be on backup, with unlimited money, maybe you could build an electricity system that works like that. Maybe. I'm not confident, but maybe you could. The problem is it would come at astronomical cost. The land use implications of it are insane. We talked about, people's, getting wind turbines built on their ranches, but you've got transmission. You'd have to have transmission crisscrossing the country. And people complain about pipelines being built on their land. Just imagine these long distance transmission crossing your land everywhere. So the implications of even attempting to do 100% wind and solar would be extraordinarily costly. And I'm not sure you can get a truly reliable grid from that, even with backups and backups. And again, because you've got natural gas ultimately backstopping all of this, you're still not going to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions ultimately. Sure. So the this is the problem with this whole exercise, is that the people don't think about it, the cost of all this. Like wind and solar cost money. They are not cheap. At a grid level, they are not cheap. And they reduce reliability, which, as you said, in our polling, we find the exact same thing. People care about the cost of electricity and the reliability. They want the light switch to go on. And we're just now getting into the times in the last couple of years where states and ratepayers are starting to see the impacts of these increases in wind generation. You're starting to see these blackout issues. You're starting to see rates going up. This is something I always bring up to people. Natural gas has been extraordinarily cheap now for 15 years because of our local generation. Coal, because of competition, and the coal plants going out of business. Coal has been very cheap recently too. So our two biggest fuel sources, something like 60%, I think, if I remember our numbers, are coming from natural gas and coal, which have gotten much cheaper in the last 15, 20 years. But electricity rights have continued to rise over that time, even though our fuel sources are cheap. So why is that happening? It's because of intermittent renewables. They raise the cost of everything. And people are just now starting to notice that their electricity bills keep going up and up and up. And they're now at risk of blackouts. There's several of the RTOs are sounding the alarm about the possibility of blackouts in the next few years because there isn't enough reserve capacity to account for the intermittency of wind and solar. So we are just getting to the point where things are getting unstable and expensive. This is something that we at IR, we've been predicting this for over a decade now, but finally consumers and voters are finally starting to see the fruits of this, and ultimately it's getting part of our goal at IER is explaining to people like this was done intentionally. This is not the war in Ukraine. It's not climate change that's raising the cost of electricity. This was an intentional policy decision to make electricity more expensive and less reliable, and that was in the name of policy goals. Most people don't really understand that, partly because electricity is difficult. I don't even understand it fully, and I've been studying it for years. So but it's important to explain to people that this was an intentional choice. This has not just happened to us.
Yeah, it was. I'll just repeat that line from the Associated Press story about the woman whose community in the Four Corners was destroyed. Who do I blame for this? Well, you weren't paying attention to the people making the policies that ultimately destroyed your community. And right. I think she's feeling it more directly because the mines are shutting down and the power plants are shutting down. But I think, as you said, when the ratepayers are starting to pick up on this, whether it's the bill or whether it's a reliability issue, if mama is monitoring the baby with the baby monitor and there's no electricity to keep the baby monitor going, a whole lot of Americans are going to finally wake up to this. They're going to have to really deal with the consequences of this. The Institute for Energy Research, folks, Kenny Stein is with IER, one of the best energy policy groups out there. They are taking on billions of dollars in lobbying, in corporate America embracing all this, in elected officials at the federal, the state, the local level spinning all sorts of elaborate fantasies about our wonderful green future. Kenny, how can people hook up with your group and learn more about what you do?
Yep, it's pretty simple. instituteforenergyresearch.org. We have running commentary on things that are going on, and we periodically produce more in-depth studies with specific issues. It's very easy to find us.
Great. Mr. Stein, will you agree on camera that you will come back and we will do a whole nother hour on transportation fuel, not electricity, and we'll be doing fracking and oil and gas and all that good stuff, because you guys do wonderful work on that too.
Yeah, this is the thing. Energy makes the world go round, so it's a lot to cover.
Absolutely. Thank you. Folks, that was Kenny Stein. Thank you for joining us. We hope we have contributed to the debate somewhat. That's what we're here to do at the Southwest Public Policy Institute. We're here to provide, to protect the unique, the wonderfulness of our 8-state region in the United States, and try to fix some of the problems that we do have. And not all of those problems are California and New Mexico. Well, we also, we have to work on some other problems, even pop up occasionally in some of our other states as well. We want our community, our section of the country, to really continue to stand as a beacon of opportunity for the United States. So many people coming to our part of the country, and we're glad to have you all. But let's keep it going. Southwestpolicy.com to check out our work. You can give us a tax-deductible donation. We are a nonprofit organization, and we'd love to keep our TV show cost-free every Friday, so we can bring you great guests like Mr. Stein. So visit us at southwestpolicy.com, read our work, maybe kick us a couple bucks, maybe retweet us or like us on Facebook and all that kind of stuff. We're doing important work as a startup organization, and I dare say we're punching above our weight as a young startup organization, and a lot more great stuff is to come, but we can't do it without your help. Thank you for joining us today. We will be back next Friday. Thanks.